So now I will speak of a discipline that is able to address the problem of consciousness from the midst of consciousness itself. This discipline is called phenomenology, a word that was invented by Edmund Husserl, a German philosopher of the beginning of the 20th century. So according to phenomenology, the problem of consciousness should be turned completely upside down. You should not ask whether consciousness can come or not from the brain and its processes, but rather how we come to believe that there is a brain out of the contents of our consciousness. And therefore, for instance, we have to ask, can we understand how objectivity and objective science in general is generated out of phenomena presented to our consciousness? But first I have to give some ideas of what is phenomenology. Phenomenology, according just to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, phenomenology is the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first-person point of view. But, you know, this definition is good, it's appropriate, but it's a little bit too, I would say, too elementary. In fact, when you study consciousness, you do not study it from a certain standpoint. You study consciousness from consciousness itself. And this is what another phenomenologist, Martin Heidegger, said in a very cryptic way when he expressed himself this way. Phenomenology, he said, means to let that which shows itself, namely appearance, be seen from itself, namely from appearance. It is a way to let appearance appear, so to speak. Of course, it looks strange because appearance obviously appears, but appearance let other things appear. For instance, appearance let the objects that appear. But in phenomenology, you don't want just to see the objects that appear. You want to be aware of appearance itself. That's the reason why this definition is a little bit strange. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French phenomenologist, gave a more metaphorical definition of phenomenology. He said that phenomenology means coming back to that world before knowledge, compared to which any scientific determination is abstract, just as geography is with regard to landscape. Science gives a geographical map of the world, but phenomenology is an exploration of the landscape of the world. And what is the landscape of the world? Experience. The landscape of our world as we live it is experience. Also, Maurice Merleau-Ponty insists that phenomenology is meant to come back to that world before knowledge. That means that you suspend any belief about the world and you just see the world as it is, namely qua experience once again. To do that, to come back to that world before knowledge, you have to suspend any belief. You have to suspend any knowledge that you believe you have about the world. And this is why a phenomenologist, the first gesture a phenomenologist should perform is called the epoche. In Greek, this means suspension, cessation, suspension of any judgment, verbal or preverbal, verbal when they are expressed in words, and preverbal when we think we recognize something in perception. There is a Sanskrit word which is the exact equivalent of this Greek epoche. This Sanskrit word is nirodha, and it intervenes everywhere in Indian thought. It intervenes in the second word second verse, of the Yoga Sutras, and it intervenes in the third noble truth of Buddhism. In the Yoga Sutras, it's especially appealing because the second verse of the Yoga Sutra says that yoga is the suspension of any mental process. And in the same way, in phenomenology, you suspend all these conceptual beliefs and attend to the very flavor, presence of experience. Francisco Varela, who was very keen on phenomenology, gave excellent definitions of these processes. He said, the phenomenological epoche is similar to doubt. It is a sudden, transient suspension of beliefs about what is being examined. The result, after the epoche, is that the field of experience appears less encumbered and more vividly present. And I think this vivid presence of experience is both the result of the phenomenological epoche and of the suspension of any judgment by a practitioner of meditation. Also, there is another act that the phenomenologist should perform after the integral suspension of judgment of the epoche. It is called the reduction. The reduction means that you reduce, literally, all that you believe to experience. And you come back to experience and you examine experience. And Francisco Varela said, turn the direction of the movement of thinking from its habitual content-oriented direction backwards towards the arising of thoughts themselves. So usually you turn your attention towards the thought of objects, but in this case you turn your attention towards the very act of paying attention to something, therefore to your own experience. Okay, but turning the attention back to experience may mean, and you will see that it's indeed the case to a certain extent, may mean that you only believe that in experience. You believe that only experience exists and all the objects of experience are just contents of experience. Is it the case in phenomenology? As I told you, to a certain extent. And phenomenology sometimes look like an idealism, a version of philosophical idealism. For instance, already in 1900, in his logical investigations, Edmund Husserl said, objects are given only as a target of our attention. So objects are not given out there as if they were completely independent of what we do to attend to them. They are given only as a target of our attention. Later on, Husserl said things that are even stronger and go even further in the direction of idealism, such as this one. In 1913, Husserl insisted that the field of pure experience is what he called the totality of absolute being. You remember Buddhists who said exactly that. Experience is our absolute being. Objects of experience are given by incomplete adumbration, Abschattungen in German, and they can only claim being. So objects claim being, they do not have being, they claim it, whereas experience is being, absolute being. So you see, this point of view is clearly close to philosophical idealism. And also in this other text of the same period, Husserl said, nature cannot be the condition for the existence of consciousness, since nature itself turns out to be a correlate of consciousness. So you cannot find the origin of consciousness into an object of consciousness. This is what Husserl pointed out. And here, maybe in a text of 1931, the so-called Cartesian meditation, we see Husserl saying, there is no nature, except insofar as it is constituted in an ordered process of consciousness. So nature itself is constituted in consciousness. Therefore, here again, you cannot find consciousness as a byproduct of a natural process. On the other hand, when he was asked whether he was indeed a philosophical idealist, Husserl was nuanced. He said, maybe yes, maybe you're right, but beware, my idealism is not a metaphysical view. I do not claim that, consciousness exists and the outer world doesn't exist. I claim nothing, in fact. I just try to recollect myself onto my own doings. And by recollecting on my own doing, by going back to the very basis of every one of my beliefs, so here what I find is a set of experiences. That's the reason why I think it's better to be very careful not to go beyond experience without very good reasons. So to express that otherwise, I would say that Husserl accepted that he was an idealist, but only a methodological idealist, not a dogmatical idealist. As a phenomenologist, he said, I've put myself out of the circuit, like all the others, in such a way that there is not even a solus ipse left. Here, this sentence is very crucial because, when someone is coherently idealist, he could say, oh, the only thing that exists is my own experience. I am the only one who exists, which is a doctrine that is called solipsism. But here, Husserl insists that when he suspends his judgments and his beliefs, he suspends all his judgments and beliefs, including the judgments and beliefs about himself. And therefore, there is not even a solus ipse left, namely, solipsism is dissolved by phenomenology. Phenomenology is so agnostic that it doesn't even believe in oneself, in the subject of the experience. It only pays attention to what is given, and what is given is experience of things and experience for someone, but things and someone are suspended, and what remains is just experience, neutral experience, neither objective nor subjective. Husserl insisted that at any rate I am given to myself in an immediate way only in the pure present of my life. So any attempt from myself to build a personal identity which is enduring in time and which I call my ego out of this pure present experience is a construction. And the phenomenologist should get rid of any construction and suspend any judgment whatsoever, including on this construction that I call my ego. So you see that Husserl's phenomenology is much more radical than idealism, in fact. It goes beyond idealism in the same direction as idealism, but without even keeping the idea that there is something that exists, that is consciousness, that is my consciousness. And here you have a sentence and quotation by Francisco Varela. In Phenomenology, he wrote, consciousness is a foundation which sheds light on how derived notions such as subjectivity and objectivity are elaborated. And therefore, according to Francisco Varela, just as according to Husserl, objectivity and subjectivity are not opposed intrinsically. They are both built out of the neutral ground of a single conscious experience, maybe a present conscious experience. Now, what about the relation between phenomenology and science? You see that the standpoint of phenomenology is very different from the usual standpoint of scientific research. And according to Husserl, there is a problem in this scientific stance, which is essentially a naturalistic and objectivistic stance. According to Husserl, an exclusive belief in the claims of the science of nature is a symptom of the crisis of the European culture, as he called one of his books in 1936. Namely, in fact, the fact that we believe only in the claims of the science of nature makes us completely blind to other features of life and the world that are not things that can be objectified. Consciousness is one of the things that cannot be objectified. And therefore, we are blind to consciousness. And it's exactly what we have seen in previous lectures, namely that some specialists of cognitive science end up saying that experience is nothing, that experience is an illusion, that there is no such thing as experience, and so on. So here we have, according to Husserl, a symptom of the major crisis of the European culture and the Western culture in general. One of the elements of this crisis is a problematic inversion. The lived origin of knowledge, namely consciousness, namely experience, is taken as secondary with respect to its scientific byproduct. And in fact, this should not be so. According to Husserl, I quote him, a substitution is accomplished, or was accomplished, in Galileo. Galileo was the founder of modern physics at the beginning of the 17th century. According to Galileo, the mathematical world, which is a construction of human minds, is taken for the only real world, and the phenomena are taken for causal consequences of natural processes existing in the form of mathematical properties. So, in fact, we completely invert things. We should be aware that mathematics is our construction, and yet we take a mathematical model of the world as a basis of ourselves, qua conscious experiential beings. And this generates what I like to call the blind spot of scientific knowledge, and especially the hard problem of consciousness. Because when you have said, okay, everything that exists is just this mathematical physical model of the universe, then you are at pain to know how consciousness, in the deepest sense of lived experience, can be generated by this mathematical and abstract model. Maybe Michel Henry had a good point when he said that science has missed something essential, nothing less than its own foundation, the lived life of the researcher. Okay? So science can pay attention to everything except to itself, qua lived life of scientists. And this can be also a symptom of a sufferance, of a collective sufferance. And it was characterized by Michel Henry in the following way. Life negates itself to escape its own anxiety and suffering. We escape towards objects to ignore ourselves. We escape towards objects, towards what we desire and so on, in order to escape the basic existential problem of human beings. So in order to correct this tendency, maybe the first move would be to turn the problem upside down again. Namely, since the advent of science has tried to show how consciousness is generated out of a mathematical model of the physical world, maybe now we can ask, how does the mathematical model of the physical world comes from an operation of consciousness? Doing that would be going towards a mindful science, namely a science which is mindful of its own origin, a science that is mindful of its foundation in the lived experience of scientists. Finally, I would like to ask whether we can validate phenomenological descriptions, because a criticism of phenomenology, a frequent criticism of phenomenology, is to say, okay, you speak of your experiences, but how can I check that? Because it's, after all, your experiences are purely personal. I cannot check whether you are right or not. They are subjective, and subjectivity is, you know, impossible to verify. So there are modes of validating phenomenological descriptions. How? When a description is recognized by other subjects as an acceptable account of an experience they have had. For instance, if someone says, oh, you know, I have a pain in my back, you say, okay, I know what you mean, because I know what is having pain in the back. So you recognize something that is experienced by someone else and described by this someone else as something that you could have yourself. And in that case, you say, oh, maybe I think this description is quite adequate. It's exactly this way that when you read a book of phenomenology, you don't read it as a text completely foreign to any category you have. You read it as a book about yourself. You suddenly realize that this guy who has written the book of phenomenology, for instance, Edmund Husserl or Maurice Merleau-Ponty, knows what you feel. And then you can recognize that this description is correct, because this description speaks of you, speaks of something that you know, speaks of something that you experienced. Many phenomenologists have said exactly that. For instance, John Findlay in 1948 said, the general character of a man's experience is a public matter that can be shown by making people attend to similar experiences in themselves. Strangely, he said, the experience of a human being is a public matter. Whereas you would say, it's a private matter. No, it's a public matter. Why? Because in order to help someone know what you feel, you just have to invite this someone else to have a similar experience in herself. Hermann Schmidt, a German phenomenologist, said something similar. A phenomenological description is valid, he said, if it can become exemplary for the self-understanding of other human beings. Namely, when you give a phenomenological description of your experience, you believe that someone else can have the same experience and can recognize it. And this description can become exemplary of the self-understanding of someone else than yourself. If you have done that, then you have done good phenomenology. And I would say validated phenomenology. Also, there are methods of indirect validation. For instance, neurophenomenology is one of these methods. Namely, here neurobiology intervenes not as a revelation of the ultimate origin and nature of consciousness, but it intervenes as a correlate of consciousness, so close correlate that you can validate a phenomenological description if and only if it has a given type of correlate in the brain. So here neurology helps validate the phenomenological description. But the phenomenological description can help understanding the meaning and function of this or that neurobiological process. So here there is a mutual constraint and a mutual validation of neurobiological findings and phenomenological findings.